Have you ever had that feeling that your research is sort of virtual and not going anywhere? And that's, I think, is a good representation of that. But that wasn't really the reason that I started on the journey I'm about to talk about. Which way it is? I was raised in South Australia. Everyone thinks it's a long way away. It's not actually, it's very close. Everything else is a long way away. Best way to describe its location is it's where Swift chose to put Lilliput. So I was raised in Lilliput. But actually, I knew that as a child. And I got interested in different sort of model communities. I also admit that I read all of the Foundation series, and that got me interested in the modelling of Harry Seldon. I'm prepared to admit that now because Paul Krugman, the New York Times columnist and Nobel Prize winner, had the same start in his career. The town I grew up in actually was also very interesting in forming some of my initial ideas about what I was going to do. It was a little railway town. My father drove the trains there. I went to school in a 3-room, 2-teacher school. But if I looked out of the window in one direction, you saw areas which grew wheat every year. If you looked out the other direction, you saw saltbush, where you could never grow crops. In fact, it was on what they call Goyder's Line. Now, there's a fascinating history, I won't go into it, but somebody in the first European to go out through that area drew this line, and it was accurate to today. But that got me interested. What controls this? I was also lucky enough to be brought, well, my friends were, or many of my friends were Aboriginal kids. So we'd go out into the bush out this way. You could go 400 kilometres in that direction without hitting another major road. So it was a wonderful place to be in, but it gave you a sense of landscape and the connectedness of landscape and people to the landscape, because they talked about the landscape as how they lived in it, how it connected to itself. I then went to the University of Adelaide, still in Lilliput. In fact, I wrote my first article in a university magazine in 1967 on what would be the threats of the 2000s, and I suggested that climate change might be one of those threats. The interesting thing was, to me, was that it provoked an outraged editorial in a local newspaper, a bit of a evening rag, which the headline here is "Horse Doping Sensation." You turn to page 3 and you know what was going to be on page 3. So I thought, doesn't matter, this guy Rupert, he's never going to go anywhere, so don't worry about it. I did my PhD actually back in the landscapes. I got a good scholarship, I stayed at Adelaide, and but it was the time of the IBP, not the IBGP, but the IBP, the International Biological Program, where people were first trying to model whole ecosystems. And I had an opportunity to come to the US and work with different people there. I made the bad decision of staying in Adelaide, but it was a good decision because I saw more of these potential supervisors because they visited Australia often, so I got a lot of advice from them. But I actually tried to put the model of a whole sheep paddock, 7,000 hectares, and to take it everywhere from the initial weather generators through all the various steps, developing new techniques for estimating biomass from photos, sheep hunger, thirst, heat balance models. I found out in passing that, for example, that the heat balance, which was based on the dinosaur studies that Gates had done a few years earlier, that he'd actually regarded dinosaurs as being the size of a pine needle. And as a result, that dinosaurs must have been warm-blooded, but I didn't bother to publish it because I was too busy on the thesis. It got a lot of publicity later when somebody else did it. But carrying it right on through to eventually looking at the effects of changing paddock layout, which was interesting to the owner of the property, obviously, but also on the effect of super sheep. See, Australia had a huge breeding program to breed these bigger sheep that could walk further, and etc., etc., and also the impact of climate change. I found that the impact of super sheep was going to be very deleterious, which meant that the whole CSI research program, which has had millions of dollars spent on it, was called into question. So that killed a lot of my job options in CSIRO. Luckily, I had a a student come along to follow this up, where we actually changed the layout of a paddock, and he actually monitored that and measured it in time. And that was Mark Stafford Smith, who is now leading the Future Earth program. I then went to Australian National University to the research schools. And these were an unusual institution because basically what happens if you have a research position there, you are given 3 years' money. No questions asked, there's the money. And it was quite good funding. But after 3 years, of course, you were reviewed very, very severely for what you'd done. Now, it meant that we could take a gamble, though. You could say, let's look at this climate change issue more deliberately. What I actually looked at was, and I took my advice from my mentor, who was Ralph Slatcher, who eventually became the Chief Scientist of Australia and Ambassador to UNESCO and various other things. But he basically said, look for a problem out there in society that has a science base, but is not being solved. And you'll find something which is going to be, often have some very fundamental scientific challenges in it, and it might be useful. And so I moved on to working on, or kept on working on the effect of humans on landscapes. Started looking at plant succession theory, described plant succession in formal linguistic terms, which was very theoretical, but at the same time, it had real implications for people working in, for example, on fire control. We introduced a small-scale planned mosaic pattern burning system, which we used in Australia and tried to get used in California, but everyone objected to the smoke, so it never got anywhere. But ultimately moving on, obviously, to climate change. The other thing that Ralph Slatcher did was that he was very much involved in international science, international research. He started a project, we together started a project on fire ecology under the SCOPE program. Ralph then went off to UNESCO and said, right, you can take it over. I was only 2 years postdoc at that stage. So I found myself leading an international cooperative science program with the other main partner in South Africa, which has caused all sorts of problems during the big apartheid era. But it was my introduction to international science. I then went on and started working with global change in terrestrial ecosystems, but it really brought home to me, firstly, how wonderful it was to work with some of the top people in the field, to share ideas across a huge range of disciplines, and also, what value you got out of it. I mean, our big success, I think, was when the EC basically modelled their funding model for the coming, what were they then, I've forgotten, 5-year periods or whatever, on our science plan, which gave us just a huge funding boost. So you could see by coming together, arguing, we argued a lot, debating this, working out science plans, you could actually have an impact on the wider range of science, not just a few people sitting in the room. Several times here, this issue of the conflict between public good and academic advancement has come up. We don't get promotion if we get involved in the public. And this is something I certainly ran into. I just simply chose the mix I enjoyed doing and said, to hell with the consequences. And as a result, I didn't get appointed a professor at the university because I wasn't publishing enough. I was doing other things which I'll come to. But in about 1990, ANU changed its approach because it was the national university in the national capital. So a lot of people were spending a lot of time advising government. And they just said, we'll judge you on 3 fields. You have to choose at least 2 to be judged against. And those fields were research, teaching, and public good. And that was a huge change in the university, a huge change in what people would do. And I think it was very advanced at the time. I became more and more involved in forest management. It came about accidentally almost. I got asked to join a panel on sustainable forestry, which was a brawl between the foresters and the Greens, and I was sort of stuck in the middle of it. Straight after that, I became a Royal Commissioner. Now, those who don't know the Royal Commission, you sit above the basic law. You have the ability to summon witnesses and send them to jail if they give you false information or don't turn up. I don't know anyone else with that power. I didn't get to use it, actually, but we threatened it a few times. There was a judge, an ecologist, and an economist working together. I learnt one hell of a lot in working in that group. Just you had to cover the range of topics. We had about 90 really good staff working for us on this project. It took 20 years to finally implement all the suggestions in that program. In fact, 2012, the last deal was done, and this year the new government in Australia is undoing those deals. So, I also took part in a number of media industry briefings, etc. And I kept on getting bad editorials again. And that guy Rupert was back again. He now owns a lot more newspapers in Australia, including the main national newspaper, and of course he was sort of spreading worldwide. But what I did actually was what we heard earlier. I cultivated a few journalists and worked through them often off the record until we could build up a story, and that seemed to work very, very effectively. Basically, we also got more involved in, say, I was asked by the government actually to start looking at what would be the impacts of Australia reducing its land clearing on meeting its Kyoto goals. This led to an argument across the Prime Minister's table about what Australia should do in going to the Kyoto negotiations, and we got them to change one word. They changed "not." So that was a useful outcome. And also obviously is involved in a lot of UNFCCC issues and IPCC and on this whole area of carbon forest sequestration. And then on a visit to the World Bank to talk with Bob Watson, one of my colleagues, I got a summons to another part of the bank. They said, could you come and help us for a year in developing a new biocarbon fund, actually trialling the stuff that we've been doing research on, setting up a fund and getting it going in developing countries. And I'd had enough of science management for a while, so I said, great, sounds wonderful. 1 year in the bank to do this. So went to the bank, and we set up the biocarbon fund. You had to go raise the funds. It was very much like academia, except that I found at the bank, you just add an extra 3 or 4 noughts. But one of the questions I kept on asking is, why are we focusing so much on mitigation when our task is ending poverty? Adaptation is actually the threat out there. You can go to Niger and talk to them about mitigation. They don't have enough emissions for them to have any real value. You're not going to do some commercial basis of, on mitigation in Niger. Niger needs help with adaptation. And finally, one of our seniors said, okay, stop telling us, just do it. And I said, well, I'm not employed here, I'm going in a few weeks. And she said, no, you're not. I'm offering you a job. And it was one I couldn't really resist. Now, one thing I think a lot of people don't recognise is that the MDBs, multilateral development banks, are huge users and funders of science. Often very bad science, often very repetitive science. People don't quite know what to do. I don't have the figures for the bank. It was going to be one of my retirement activities to work it out, which is how much they spent per year, but I know from another smaller development bank, I won't say who because it's actually confidential information at the moment, but I'm putting it up. But they spend over $100 million per year. I suggest the World Bank probably spends $200 to $300 million per year. They recently did an assessment of the quality of that research. 15% is good science. You can read the rest. So that starts to tell you there's a problem there. The same thing applies in capacity building. We've spent even more in capacity building. UNDP, it's an area that they specialise in. They do a good job of building capacity. But when you go to a country, there's no capacity. It's dissipated because capacity is not linked to actual activity. And well, my wife and I, who work in sort of the same field, we've been pushing this whole idea of just-in-time capacity support. In other words, when the project is designed, you look at what capacity is needed and you deliver it as the project is being carried out. And this way, it doesn't have time to dissipate before the project is finished.
Ian, you're about a minute from chewing into your
discussion time, okay. Therefore, I won't quote Moss because it's irrelevant. But in actual fact, it was a beautiful lead. I mean, what I wanted to say, basically, adaptation is basic and applied research, but it must fit into existing context. So my mantra in the World Bank was, adaptation is an additional factor in development. It's not the only factor. It also faced a problem, a conundrum, in that the way the UNFCCC had argued that adaptation should be paid for by separate funds from development funds, then how does a development agency like the World Bank make sure that its projects are climate resilient without breaking those rules? There are little things along the way. At the time, nobody had an estimate of what the cost of adaptation were. They said mitigation is going to cost us tens of billions or hundreds of billions per year. Adaptation is cheap. And I thought, this is wrong. I couldn't get the economists to actually make a good projection. It would be a career-limiting step to do so. It wasn't going to be career-limiting to me. So on the back of a metro ticket, I did a calculation, which says it's going to actually work out just for the bank alone between $10 and $40 billion per year. Hey, this is up there like mitigation. I thought, I'm going to get murdered for this. I sent it to Nick Stern, who I've been working with. He used it in the Stern report. So that's just to get adaptation more onto the agenda. One of the things we realised we needed to do was to actually pilot adaptation at scale. We hoped to raise a couple $100 million so that we could get countries to actually, with a significant amount of money, to bring adaptation into their development planning and then implement several projects so we could learn from those pilots really what happens. We hoped for a few $100 million. We got $1.3 billion eventually, and that's been trialled now in 18 countries. And I'm going to be very quickly, slightly to the side, but you'll realise how I'll come back to this, and actually ask, how do we use the IPCC report? This is a figure I used at SNAMS a few weeks ago, but I went through the IPCC recent report and looked at the headline statements about adaptation. And this is my classification of them. Only about 4%, or 2 out of whatever it is, were actionable. In other words, saying, if you do this, you get that. About 40% are informative. About 50% are the obvious. And why we're undoing this, I don't know. And about a few percent are potentially misleading. So I think we have to look carefully, and I think this represents the fact that adaptation does not fit well now in the IPCC process. There was a huge missed opportunity to actually just study the PPCR because it had lots of good lessons and lots of bad lessons. And I was surprised that even after 6 years after this started, that there's only one reference to the PPCR in the entire report, and I wrote that in my chapter. But there's information in it. This is very formalised information, but does it matter which agency leads the projects? And it does. Don't go to the planning agencies because they take forever to get sorted out because they're dealing with too many different groups of people. Finance agencies tend to be good leaders. Environment agencies tend to scatter across the range. Also, when we look at the projects being supported, it's interesting to see that of the ones approved so far and the ones in preparation, that more complex projects are just simply taking a lot longer to get together. I mean, that's obvious, but we're seeing hard information. Also, the private sector projects are lagging too in getting them going. Okay, what are the frontiers that I see at the moment? What are the policymakers asking? They're still asking for better forecasts, I'm afraid. But I think we're gradually getting people to realise we can't forecast the time periods they're talking about. It's going to be interesting to see how Codex affects this. I think it's going to give people a much more realistic understanding of the limitations of downscaling. And that means that the penny is going to drop, and they're going to start asking for seasonal and decadal forecasts. You can see that already, and once people come to that quite quickly. The other one is which interventions are most likely to build adaptive capacity, resilience, etc. That's still a very problematic issue, and there's a disconnect between theory and practice, I'm afraid. We've got to get these two groups together in this. Do we need transformative adaptive change? Yes, but what is transformative, of course? And most importantly, and Richard touched upon this, or talked about this earlier, how do we measure the effectiveness of adaptation? If the Green Climate Fund goes ahead, and there are billions of dollars per year going into adaptation, then countries are going to have to justify that expenditure. This is no longer small change out of the aid budget. This is big money which have to go back to Parliament and back to voters. They have to show some measurable progress. Suggestions to the scientific community: get rid of meaningless mantras. We just go on and on about uncertainty, complexity, context specific, etc., etc. We should start with what we know. I'm trying to produce a paper which starts to state in the Australian vernacular, the bleeding obvious, and say, let's stop saying that because we're just blocking up the literature with this sort of stuff. We need to develop better networks. I've been pushing very hard for centres of excellence in developing countries. These are not networks to get multidisciplinary work. That's part of it. They're simply networking so that scientists in developing countries feel confident that their science is good. Because most of them sitting in, if you're sitting in the University of Botswana, you don't have that sort of confidence. Final thing, Richard, and a little bit of hope. I was lucky enough to work on adaptation in the Arab region. I loved it. I got back into deserts. It was fantastic. That's part of in the Wadi Rum, which is where Lawrence of Arabia was filmed, where he was. But interesting things happening. This guy here cut his income on dates by 20% because he appreciated that it was getting warmer. So he took out one variety of date palms and planted a section of dates which are known to work better, grow better in warmer conditions. He's acting on his own. This guy here said, my adaptation strategy is that, firstly, so this is the Bedouin between the Bedouin tent. My adaptation strategy is one, we own a house in the town, we own an orchard, and my son is doing a master's degree in environmental science. Next two photos, do you see similarity? What is it? There, there. It was surprising how many meetings we went to in the Arab countries where children were present and totally engaged. This kid here, was following everything that went on in the discussion. These two guys are from Hezbollah. So that's it. The other great hope I have is that there are some wonderful communicators out there. And this guy's my favourite, Banksy. And while we have people like that out there on our side, then I think there is some hope. Thank you.